Good morning, students. Today, in lecture number 5, we are going to study again the concept of poetic diction by William Wordsworth. Dear students, we have seen that William Wordsworth was a very well-known poet, and he want to newly establish the language of lower and common men in poetry. The very situations and incident of the lower men in poetry. Because according to William Wordsworth, the very language, the very incident and situations which the lower and middle men use are natural. They speak from their bottom of their heart. That is original, real, natural. So, compared to the other language of the earlier people is pure. So, for the poetry or poetic purpose, if we use such a language really spoken by these lower and middle class men, the incident and situations of their life throughout as far as possible, by adding a little color of imagination, such language becomes unusual one. Hence, it becomes a newly one, extraordinary one. So, William Wordsworth was firm with this concept of using the language of these people by making a lot of oppose attack on his concept of poetic diction. And further, William Wordsworth says that beside this new trend of choosing the language of lower and middle class men, their incident as far as possible throughout by adding a little color of imagination, then ordinary thing should be presented in an unusual way. Then what will happen? Beside all this, he want to choose the traditional pattern also along with the new one. Traditional pattern means the use of personifications, use of rhymes, rhythms, use of antithesis, paraphrases, inversion, which the poets of great England are using as a style of poetry since long. He was with the support of this view, and he has also decided to use this personifications, rhyme, rhythm, paraphrases, inversion, antithesis, all such figure of speech like the other poets also. But he was firm with the addition of the language of such lower and middle class that he want to put through this concept of poetic diction. When William Wordsworth expresses his object for the first time, that using the language of lower and middle, the same attack oppose of these neoclassical and well-established poets makes this simple object, which he mentions in the preface of Lyrical Ballad in 1798 edition, the first one, the very object becomes his principal object after the attack of these neoclassical poets, oppose of this poet. And that principal object was to choose the very incident and situations that we have seen. Now, in the third phase, in the third aspect, William Wordsworth expresses his purpose about such selection. He says, what he says? Wordsworth says, my purpose means, he says, his object, principal object, then he says the purpose. My purpose was to imitate was अनुकरण करने means the language of these lower and middle class incidents, situations and routine was to imitate and as far as possible was to imitate and as far as possible to adopt the very language to adapt the very language of men and assuredly such personifications do not make any natural or regular part of the language. Look at the purpose of William Wordsworth, which he mentions in the preface to the lyrical ballad in the second edition. While mentioning his purpose of poetic diction or his concept of poetic diction, William Wordsworth says that the purpose of William Wordsworth to imitate the very language, incident, situations of lower and middle class men was to imitate and as far as possible throughout to adopt the very language of these lower and middle class of men means the middle class men and assuredly such personifications means such beauty personifications is more than any figure of speech which the poets of his time, previous time, deliberately choose such figure of speech to make the poetic style more decorative, more attractive, more praiseworthy. So Wordsworth says, if you choose the very language of these men, if you adopt the very language of men, imitate them as it is, as far as possible, throughout such incident, situations, routine, conversation, language of lower and middle class, then what will happen? He assures, means assuredly, he says, such personifications do not make any natural or regular part of the language because it will be definitely different one. Because beside this regular pattern the poets choose that will be different one. So his purpose was to make the poetry ideal, natural, praiseworthy and real one. Because why he was firm with the lower and middle class men's life, language, and he want to adopt each and everything in their life. Why? Because that is real, natural, pure as it is. But what happens? Why he says? Because the writing of the neoclassical, classical or earlier poets like Alexander Pope, which they use, that the real language was not natural. The language of such high class men in a state lower and middle, they choose the language of high aristocratic bourgeois men that was not natural. They only make the pretension, pompous show of their wealth, knowledge, and clothing, gold, jewelry, whatever they have. They just make the show of it, pompous show. That the influence of the Westerners. But in reality, these men, which are far, far away from such unnatural, pretentious, corrupt, pompous, showish world, this world is pure. Though they are illiterate, though are uneducated, they are vulgar and rustic, but their word is pure, their very language is pure. So Wordsworth was firm with the idea of adoption, idea of imitate the very language of these men, and his purpose after these two objects, principal object, first object, and this for the third time he expresses his purpose of choosing the imitating the language of this lower class men. After this, Wordsworth further expresses that beside the use of such imitation, adaptation, very language of men, lower and middle class men, etc., she says he was also with the poets of his time which they used, that he also agree with them. Beside the language of selection, he is ready to mix with the trend of the poets of his time. So he says, beside that, there will be also found in these volumes. In these volumes means poetries or collections of poetries. In these volumes, little of what is usually called poetic diction. When he says the poetic diction, concept of poetic diction, he says usual pattern of rhyme, rhythm, personification, antithesis, inversion, perichoresis. He won't use it in the pattern like the other poets, but he was only different, not with them in the language of high class people. So he want to work with, or principally he want to choose the language of lower men, and the other pattern or style he was ready with other two genres. How the other poets are using since long, he was also want to mix with that in the case of style, but not in the case of selection of language. He was ready with that. So he says, as much as pains has been taken to avoid this ordinary taken to produce it, so he says, to bring my language near to the language of men. So he says, in his concept of poetic diction, he says, to bring my, because he wants, Wordsworth wants, what he wants in the poetic diction? To bring my language. My language means the language of lower and middle class people, and the language which he want to use for the first time. So he was the pioneer, inventor, creator of this language. So to bring my language near to the language of men, near to the language of men. This is about which William Wordsworth was firm, because in these volumes he wants visually the poetic diction which he phrases, which he uses, and which he designs. In poetic diction, beside this, in the concept of poetic diction, Wordsworth further says that poetic diction means the style that the poets use in the poetry, about the style, use of figure of speech, rhyme, rhythm. He says in poetic diction means poetic style. In poetic diction, besides the use of Beside the use of personification, Wordsworth includes phrases and figure of speech. Phrases and figure of speech. Because once he affirms or confirms the poetic diction, means the diction which he has used in the which he has mentioned in the preface to the lyrical ballad, second edition of 1800, he was firm with the diction of the poetry, style of the poetry, language of the poetry, and he succeeds in using them. What is the concept of poetic diction? The very language of lower and middle class men, situation, incident, as far as possible, he want to use as the main theme, central idea, central language for the poetic diction. Beside the use of this poetic diction, the very language of men, the very incident and situations, adoption, imitation, as far as possible, throughout, he also is ready to use the personifications which Wordsworth includes like the other poets of his time, like father to son means the trend, pattern, the order other poets also use, and he was also ready to use like the other poets. So he says Wordsworth includes phrases and figure of speech like the other poets of his time. Only beside the poetic, this poetic diction was different than the others, and other thing like use of phrases, personifications, figure of speech, he was using like the usual pattern, regular pattern the other poets use. Phrases and figures of speech like father to son means traditionalism. What father does, that son accepts traditional business. That way, Wordsworth is also ready to accept the father to son means the pattern of poetry, figure of speech, phrases, rhyme, rhythm, meter, prosody that he was using like the father to son has long been regarded has long been regarded as the common inheritance. Inheritance means varsa. So regular, it becomes the regular practice. Common inheritance of poets means they commonly each and every poet uses as a tradition or common inheritance, means each and every follow like father to son. Yes, that Wordsworth is ready with all. So he uses it. Poets like periphrasis, inversion, and antithesis. And antithesis. Like the other poets, William Wordsworth was also using the common inheritance, regularly practicing patterns like phrases, figure of speech, inversion, periphrasis, antithesis, rhyme, rhythm, meter, that he was ready to accept in his concept of poetic diction, like the other poets who blindly who follow the common inheritance, common varsa, who follow the father to son method means what they have used, the other newcomers, new poets also use it. So Wordsworth was ready to use without any opposition opposition, without any refusal, he was ready to use the poetic style, the use of such praise, figure of speech, uh, common inheritance, father to son, like patterns like inversion, antithesis, paraphrases. But he was strongly opposed to the pattern use of the selection of language or the use of language which the poet since long using the very language of high class people, and language was very, we can say that language was very extravagant, artificial, not real. That language they were using. Just three words he uses beside the personification, figure of speech. He uses the terms like periphrases, also Wordsworth uses. He also uses the inversion like the other poets, and he also uses the antithesis. What periphrases mean? When you look at the meaning of the periphrases, you will come to know that use of indirect speech. Use of indirect speech means the speech which the poets use as it is in the poetic language. Use of indirect speech, like the other poets, Wordsworth was also ready to use. Use of longer phrasing. In place of possible short form of expression. He says the use of indirect speech means paraphrases. Paraphrases also means the use of longer phrasing, longer sentences, longer phrases in place of possible short form of expression. Instead of short, use the longer. Then use of unnecessarily long or roundabout form of expression. Such the poets at the time of believers were using, and so Wordsworth was also uses the pattern. For example, paraphrasing is a use of indirect speech that he uses. Use of longer phrasing instead of short, where there is no need of longer phrasing, then also they use. So Wordsworth also really follow them. Then use of unnecessary long or roundabout form of expression. Long form. Roundabout means there when there is a need to express direct views, one is using the roundabout words form of expression which were unnecessary. So this means this is in short about the paraphrases. Beside the paraphrases, Wordsworth also uses like the other poets that means inversion, the figure of speech in literature. What is meant by inversion? He says inversion means state of being invented, means new invention the poets makes, and Wordsworth is also ready. Also it means reversal of position. Most of the time in tragedy, the playwrights use the reversal of position, order, form or relationship. Most of the time here inversion instead of being invented is applicable in poetry, and another meaning a reversal of position, order, form that appears in the poetry but where in the tragedies, because poetry is the mother form of the tragedy. So in tragedy like King Lear, Hamlet, Othello, we have seen the reversal of position of the kings like King Lear, Othello, Hamlet, Macbeth from their place, position, order, relationship. That form in the tragedy and this form in the poetry. Or it means inversion means finally the normal word order. Normal word order of our structure. The poets also readily or uses in the concept of poetic fiction or at the time of Wordsworth, the normal word order of structure means simple normal word they use. They invented the state of being invention, that is also means inversion. So paraphrasis, this is the inversion, and after this I will discuss the antithesis. Antithesis, you might have known that antithesis means opposite ideas. What one want to say, the meaning is opposite, means that is the satiric language. The poets or playwrights use antithesis. Antithesis means a person or thing, that is the direct opposite of someone or something. Antithesis means sometimes what happens when you look at the satire or satiric language, maybe when you go through the satires like Rape of the Law, Battle of Books, you will find that in such allegories, in satires, what one want to say, the meaning was its opposite, because it was satiric language. So, in such language, you will find that one has the negative opinion about someone. So, in this concept of poetic diction, William Wordsworth was ready to use the pattern style of poetry like the other contemporary or the traditional poets, using the idea of figure of speech, praising, personifications, rhyme, rhythm, meters, inversion, periphrasis, antithesis, and he was firm with the only selection of his language that we want to newly use in the concept of poetic diction. With this brief information about the purpose of William Wordsworth using the concept poetic diction, and beside the poetic diction, he was also ready to use the same pattern which the traditional poets use, like the other person or common inheritance of poetry. He was ready to use the style pattern of poetry. In the next lecture, we will discuss again the further part of concept of poetic diction. With this, I stop here. Thank you very much.